Okay. I'm just going to discuss three things in my speech. Firstly, I want to quickly go over the issue as to why we think material movements or economic movements in general are almost always going to be preferred or more important than social movements in terms of priority. Secondly, I want to discuss, even if there is no clear distinction with between the two, why one should be prioritized over the other, why we just think that class difference based movements are more likely going to succeed, and thus, on a basis of net change is more important. And thirdly, I want to discuss the counterfactual and the comparative as to why, in a lot of specific contexts, why why identity-based differences are unlikely going to create successful movements. Firstly, then, I just want to start off with a quick discussion of material versus social movements, right? I want to discuss why material movements oftentimes are trying to achieve ends that are just more important or a priori to the goods that social movements come. I think there's three reasons why. Firstly, I want to point out that material minimum levels or necessities are oftentimes an a priori good to proper social agitation existing in the first place. That is to say, economic issues make it harder for you to have time to engage in politics, which are oftentimes more nuanced and more time consuming, that are required or a necessity in order for you to properly socially agitate, to be able to understand these movements, to be able to understand identity politics, and then to also be able to forward your opinion based off of them. This looks in two ways, right? Firstly, it looks very mechanistically. Things like being able to vote, being able to be a large enough tax base so that people or politicians cater towards your ideas are things that require you to meet economic minimums for you to even be able to participate in the system whatsoever. But secondly, note that oftentimes having economic issues also takes away or detracts from your ability to just have the time, have the focus, have the concentration, or the prioritization of any type of political or social issue whatsoever. So that is to say, a lot of times the class-based differences are resulting in systems that prevent people from ever being able to reach proper social agitation in the first place. Secondly, note that even if it just comes to an outcome basis, that material needs are a priori to social ones. And the reason why is because, nowadays most countries, well, not most countries, every single country in the world requires you to have money in order to gain access to your basic necessities. This looks like things like food, water, education, shelter. And unlike where I think a lot of what Op wants to discuss, this debate takes place in a lot of areas with regards to a lot of people who don't have a guaranteed access to a lot of these basic necessities. We would say that these economic barriers, irrespective of your social discrimination, are ones that come before the social discriminatory harms, because these things necessarily are a priori to your life existing, which are, harms that come before the ones that Op would want to talk about. But lastly, I just also want to talk about the solution to social issues is more likely going to come up on our side when there's eventual economic parity on the long run, where we think social issues are much easier to solve when there is a baseline for a baseline for a control group where people, in general are equal on an economic terms in the first place. So then, secondly, I want to talk about why, even if it's not true that, in general, these class-based difference movements just should take priority over identities-based difference ones, why they're more likely going to succeed on our side. And I think there's four reasons why. Firstly, because these movements are more likely going to get broader coalitions. That is to say, there's already a lot of overlap between people who are of ethnic and religious minorities and those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. But also, we get people from majority identity groups who may not suffer from identity-based disadvantages, but do suffer from economic disadvantages. The logic of capitalism inherently implies a high degree of inequality, a much smaller capitalist class and a very large working class that tends to include people from all groups. Logically speaking, that means that in almost every single capitalist country, it means that we're more likely going to get a broad-based movement that can attain critical mass when it comes to finding people on lines of class rather than finding people on lines of identity. Secondly, it's less likely going to have internal fracturing within and between these movements, right? Identitarian movements are more likely to be viewed as threatening to people from other identity groups. That is to say, the logic of racial hierarchy implies that elevating some groups would reduce the social status and power of other groups. People tend to have a negative, visceral negative reaction to the fear that they could lose social power as a result of progressive change, and that means that they almost always are forced upon themselves to have a reactionary response to any hint at progressive change potentially happening. This means that there's an inherent tension that exists between these movements, right? When you represent an identity group, you experience pressures from within that group to further narrow your aims and be more specific in your demands. However, the more specific you get representing group A, the less likely groups B and C will be to believe your movement actually represents them, and thus are likely to actually support you, right? So the more you cater to one group, the less you're able to cater to other groups, and oftentimes it leads to the fracturing of these movements. Thirdly, there's plausible deniability. That is to say, one of the largest issues is that many moderates or many conservatives just tend to not believe that these social issues are actually social issues, right? It oftentimes means that they can plausibly deny things like subconscious biases or unquantifiable discrimination as things like, people just being lazy, the fact that, certain races just don't want to achieve more or they don't want to work as hard as other races. And fourthly, these movements are more likely to be co-opted, right? Those in power can use the logic of identity politics to prevent structural change. That is to say, it's much easier for extractive institutions to be nominally committed to racial justice or LGBTQ rights than it is to commit to structural reforms to how resources are distributed. Doing so allows oppressors to escape responsibility and align with these movements. These movements are likely to accept this compromise to achieve their short-term political aims, i.e. the rise of corporate wings of formerly progressive labor parties in the Western world. The result ultimately is that you're more likely to get these aesthetic changes, but the institutional structures that allow for discrimination will continue to exist. I just want to lastly then discuss why all of these reasons as to why we're more likely going to succeed also comes alongside the fact that the counterfactual is likely going to look worse in a few contexts, right? The first thing to talk about is many of the countries we're talking about have extremely strong fissures, historically speaking, when it comes to racial and religious lines. That is to say, most post-colonial countries exhibit this, right? This looks like Singapore, where the residential areas are intentionally split up among Indians, Chinese, and Malays to prevent them from being able to form a political coalition that could resist the elite. It means that even in the process of decolonization, major powers recognize that by elevating one group over others, they could keep a degree of influence over all people in general. When politics are construed along these lines, it means that major parties tend to sort into representing the dominant versus minority ethnic and social groups. It means that politically speaking, it becomes almost untenable for you to ever get any change. Ultimately, we think it's more important to deal with class-based issues, but even if it's not true, we think we can just solve these issues more often. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for those remarks, and now we welcome the leader of opposition to begin the case for their side of the debate. Hear, hear.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. There we go. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Look, I think it's hard. Let's face it, outside the debater social bubble, not everyone is intuitive or inherently socialist. It's hard for it to be the basis of activism when most people don't understand the economic struggles that they face or do not have the capacity to actively engage with it. A couple of responses to OG before I engage on those same clashes about number one, who can best define their interest such that it actually achieves upliftment for the people they represent, and number two, who can best achieve those defined interests. So firstly, let's deal with a couple of things that we hear from OG, right? So they say, material welfare is necessary for you to participate or confront the system. Things like concentration or the bandwidth that you have for things like voting, political engagement, and social movements in general. Exactly, right? So I don't understand how they suddenly agitate a bunch of impoverished people to suddenly achieve socialist enlightenment when the pressures of poverty still exist, right? Things like reduced bandwidth, ability to engage in politics is severely limited. I don't understand why they suddenly are able to suddenly achieve socialist enlightenment to the extent that they still exist in poverty. Furthermore, I think this also takes down that broad-based movement argument, right? Which is that poor people are more able to agitate into a larger base. This is on the assumption that you can immediately galvanize these poor people in the first place. To the extent you already intrinsically admit that these people have limited bandwidth, I just don't understand why you can suddenly agitate them or get them to devote huge amounts of time to your movement. Furthermore, they also understand that fissures still exist, right? The idea of race, the idea of gender, which has historically been used to separate people. I don't understand why some of these people can suddenly understand their mutual class interests with each other when these fissures have been historically entrenched. And so, for example, if I am a poor woman and I see, for example, a poor man, I don't understand why I can feel that mutual solidarity with him and join a movement where he seems like where he's also within that movement and we seem to be campaigning for the same interests. I don't understand why I can overcome that historical trauma and suddenly join hands with him. The comparative is just like, look, we utilize those fissures and get people who understand that interest to be similar, and therefore get the people, for example, who have the time, the capacity to agitate on behalf for the entire group, right? Also, I reject that this is true, right? I also think that you can realize your identity irregardless of your material well-being, right? You realize your identity by, for example, when you're catcalled in the street or you get yelled racial slurs when you're walking down that street, right? So I think you understand your identity much more visually than, for example, your like material welfare, even if you even if they counter assert the opposite. So going on to my main argument, right? Number one, who can define their best interests such that they actually achieve empowerment for the people they represent? This is where I'm going to prove to you that poor women have more interests aligned with, for example, rich women versus poor women and poor men. That identity is a much larger axis upon which they are discriminated, and identity forms the basis upon which they are denied economic upliftment. Because note that they are entangled concepts, right? The reason why lots of women are denied accessibility in the workplace is because, for example, they are seen to be too emotional. They are seen to, for example, maybe have children and be saddled with child-rearing responsibilities, and therefore seem to be less productive, right? Because of this, I think when we tackle the identity, which forms the basis of rejecting people economic upliftment, we can better co-opt all of Gov's aims because we give them the economic upliftment they're looking for. Two tiers as to this. Note that because your identity is an uncontrollable factor of your identity, I think it means that people face a lot more severe harms associated with it, right? This looks like emotional trauma as well as being denied economic levers of ascension. For example, when someone rejects you because of your identity, for example, you are a woman or you are a minority or you are queer, I think this means that you are seen to be being rejected on a fundamental part of who you are, because this is something that you cannot control, right? This is something that you cannot change. Therefore, the emotional trauma that is able to, for example, prevent you from ever trying for that promotion is much stronger, because this is something that you can never ever affect, right? Note that compared to, for example, your capitalist class, I think loads of people belonging to a capitalist society are indoctrinated with the idea that mobility is possible, right? That even if they start off poor, they can eventually change their economic class in the future. And so therefore, in their head, economic class is a much more fluid concept to people than, for example, things like identity, race, or gender, right? So because it's not an intrinsic part of who they are not as emotionally harmed, for example, when they are discriminated on the basis of economic class, and therefore it does not form a fundamental axis of their life. Furthermore, it is just true that many types of oppression are just not class-based in nature, right? Even if they are often enmeshed and can often intersect, right? For example, race is to do with the idea of your civilized nature, right? Is it to do with your intellectual capacity, is your hygiene, your ability to engage a sophisticated culture. As a woman, for example, you are discriminated on the basis of your emotional expression, that you are less rational than men, right? For all these things, these are not class-based in nature, and they are far more fundamental, because those are the things that society uses to deny you that economic ascension in the first place, that you're not suited to our capitalist production modes because you are all these things, right? Irrational, uncivilized, etc. So second tier, optical, right? The idea that your identity is far more immediate and people can see it and therefore immediately discriminate on you. So this means it occurs to far more people because they are immediately identified as belonging to that group and they're discriminated on that basis. Note that because I've identified that social political power exists independently of class, note that within these movements are class-based, hierarchies then form, right? Because men have more social political capital than women, men get to define the interests of that movement. This leads to the erasure of identity-based differences. The reason why erasure of identity-based differences is much worse than, for example, the erasure of class differences is because I've proven to you that identity is the basis upon rejecting you the upliftment, right? That's why it is so much more harmful when you erase those identity-based differences. So second clash, who can best achieve their defined interests, right? Three tiers. A, buy-in. So for example, look, I just told you that people are typically indoctrinated into capitalism and therefore believe that they can work hard enough to work their way out of poverty. The dream is of individual upliftment and not social upliftment. So I don't think people feel necessarily the desire to join these movements to the extent that they can lie to themselves, that they can work their way out of poverty. You can't work your way out of being Asian. You can't work your way out of being LGBT. So therefore, there is much more impetus for you to join a social movement because it is the only mechanism through which you can achieve upliftment. So we get more buy-in on our side. Second tier, about political and economic capital. Look, rich people are just useful for your movement, right? For example, when you have rich women in the feminist movement. Why? Two reasons. A, you get more funding and donations for your ability to do things like political lobbying or to just do things like campaigning to reach more people. Second tier, visibility. When you have rich female CEOs, or for example, rich female celebrities speaking out for your movement, you get more reach in media because they are more visible in that nature, right? So because of that, you have more people being aware of this cause in the first place because they got people like Beyonce talking about the feminist movement. Last year, about the system, right? I just think that threatening capitalism is a much bigger threat to, for example, society, because you are threatening the system upon which political parties depend upon, things like funding from corporations. For all these reasons, like, just take this debate.
Thank the speaker for her remarks, and I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Cool. One moment. Let me just get a timer. Panel, the first thing to consider is that our side is strictly better for getting the outcomes that both teams seem to care about. Again, a lot of the material we heard from opening opposition was just why it's important that we give credence to these discussions about individuals, criteria that they cannot change, their race, the fact that they're LGBT, the fact that they're women, etc. And we agree. But if they can't prove that these movements will meaningfully succeed, and if they can't prove that they can actually create an impetus for change, then they lose the debate. And we basically got 1 minute of material on how they're actually going to succeed. So the first thing I want to talk about is how we actually create a better mechanism for the kinds of identitarian change that they want. I think there's 3 things under this. Number 1 is what Brian told you in the Prime Minister's speech, is that the pressures of poverty mean that people can't engage in these movements in the first place. I think we warranted that in most of these countries, there's a strong overlap between economic destitution and being part of these minority groups. So they respond to this by saying, well, how do you get any movement then? If these people are poor, how are they going to push for class-based change? Our entire point is that there are probably people, for example, from the majority group that are still going to have the political clout to push for class-based change, and that you're more likely to get a coalition that actually reaches out into the majority group, because those individuals, given the structure and logic of capitalist systems that exist in these countries, also suffer from things like discrimination against workers, also want certain universal public goods like an education system or a healthcare system that takes care of these people. And if you can bring these people in and get those basic public goods, then in the long run, your coalition expands. Because once people actually have access to healthcare, to education, to a basic minimum standard of living, then you bring in new people from minority identitarian groups that weren't involved in the political process in the first place. The existence of these social programs means that people can actually turn out to vote and join movements, which means in the long term, the overall scope of issues that progressive parties can cater to expands when you first care about economic issues. But there's 2 more reasons why we think we're a prerequisite. Number 1 is that these issues are more apparent when there actually is economic parity in these countries. It is easier for feminist movements to make the argument that the reason why women face discrimination is actually because they're women and not because of the economic choices that they have made, when you actually have data to back up the fact that women who have the same education and came from similar economic backgrounds still get worse outcomes in the labor market. These arguments are quickly shot down by reactionary parties and individuals on the right who can say that it's economic choices that actually undergird people's exploitation when you don't actually have some meaningful form of economic mobility in these countries in the first place. But the third and final thing I want to say, and I think this answers a lot of the material we heard from opening opposition, is that once we build broader and more successful coalitions on our side, minority identity groups become meaningful stakeholders in these movements. We think this looks like things like Black voters, for example, rallying behind the Democratic Party to elect Lyndon Baines Johnson, even though he was not that progressive on racial issues, because he supported a conception of certain basic public goods. But now, with Black voters being a meaningful stakeholder in the Democratic Party, they were able to get that very same administration to enact the Civil Rights Act. And it looks like the modern Democratic Party today, which actually caters to these identitarian considerations, because there was first a baseline coalition that was able to be formed around working people's rights when you didn't have the coalition for identity identity-based change in the United States. We think that the alternative is a splintering effect, where these identitarian movements splinter into even more well-defined groups of smaller numbers of people. And this is because of the inherent tension that exists in these movements, which was material that was completely unanswered by the opening opposition team. The idea that once you're beholden to one identity group, in order for you to meaningfully be salient for that group, you need to narrow your focus and focus more on the individual experiences of a small subset of people. But the result is that every other group of people then sees that party not only as not representing them, but potentially as a threat to their order in the social hierarchy. We think that the number of people who feel threatened by a minority identity group constructing politics around their identity is probably a lot larger than the smaller subset of people who feel threatened by the push for example, a more inclusive healthcare system or a more inclusive economic system that benefits 90% plus of the people in these societies. So we think that to the extent that you want to get any kind of change for these groups and access any kind of the upliftment mechanisms you heard in opening opposition, we're strictly better. Okay, a couple more points of rebuttal to the opening opposition bench. The first thing we heard is that economic class is a more fluid concept, so people are less likely to identify these concerns as intrinsic harms. We don't think this is meaningfully true in a lot of the countries we're talking about. When people literally cannot eat, when they cannot get the basic goods they need to feed their children and house them, they do not view the system as fluid. And a lot of these countries where you don't actually have well-developed welfare states where people have a conception of basic goods, they view the system as completely illegitimate, and they believe that the conditions they were born into, which is also something that they could not meaningfully control, are the reason why they face these dire economic consequences. So then there is no impetus for them to view the system as fluid, and they're just as likely to view this as a salient issue that must be changed through the political process. Remember, the only meaningful comparative then is how many people actually see this experience and relate to it. And we think that there are far more people who actually relate to the experience of being economically disadvantaged, especially when, by definition, opening opposition has to defend a conception of politics that relies on a minority group of people. The second thing we heard from them is that you're more likely to see hierarchies form within these movements and to erase these differences. And I think there's 2 points to note here. Number one is that we would more likely, or rather, have hierarchies within nominally progressive parties that are committed to certain progressive goals that are still good for minority identity groups than to have hierarchies in the national realm of politics where the dominant party ends up being one that actually represents the majority group, and the result predominantly is reactionary politics where the people in the driver's seat actively want harms on these minority groups. We would rather have a Democratic Party that probably caters a little bit more to working white people than it does to working black people, but at least has the power to achieve change that are good for everyone. But secondly, I think the mechanism about building broader coalitions and over time making minority groups into meaningful stakeholders within these movements is incredibly important here. If these people become stakeholders over time because they have the economic rights to actually engage in the politics, it is more likely that they can actually change these systems from within. Quickly, the POI from closing.
Yeah, but you never. Oh.
Is that protected time? Sorry. So moving on then. Lastly, we heard that you get better movements and that you get better mechanisms for upliftment. We heard 2 things here. They said, firstly, that this is the only mechanism for upliftment. I think this relies on the idea that this is the only thing people see as an intrinsic harm, which I'm already answered. Second, they said that rich people are useful for your movements. And I think this bites directly into our analysis about how these movements are co-opted, right? If individuals are willing to make the short-term compromise to work with the structures that are in power in order to get certain aesthetic changes, it means that those structures will not change. But it is those very structures that allow for discrimination to exist in the first place. So normatively speaking, more people are subject to discrimination on their side. I think the second thing to note here, though, is that this turns people off from your movement. If you see movements that want identitarian change allying with the oppressor, it looks more likely that everybody else who is oppressed by those systems turns away from identitarian change and moves in a reactionary direction. Again, opening opposition did not engage with the comparative. The comparative is not that you get identitarian policies in power. The comparative is that you have reactionary movements that are in the driver's seat. We're very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for those remarks, and I would like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for their side. Hear, hear.
Am I slow to go? Good, cool. Just give me a second.
things in my speech. Number one, which of the narratives gets you more buy-in from people? Secondly, where are you actually more likely to achieve your goals through interactions with the state, etc. Before that, a couple of things that are extraneous. The first thing they say is that poverty and identity issues overlap, given that you're going to have bigger movement. Know that in case this is true, then our identity movement will also probably still advocate for the economic issues, given that the economic struggles will apply to the majority of people in our identity movement. The difference is then how we are labeling ourselves and on what basis we are mobilizing. They say that on their side, majority ethnic groups will have clout. So on their side, their movements can have some sort of political ability. I'm generally unclear why, right? They themselves analyze why poor people just don't have the ability to influence politics in the first place. I'm unclear why they just now can claim that the fact that you will have some white people in your movement, now you are able to push. Note then that if you are doing this trade-off, we will rather have the rich people involved than the majority ethnic group involved, given that rich people are able to do for things like lobbying for us, or things like representation already within political spectrum for us. They never explain why the white people are so incredibly necessary to have in that movement. The second on the idea of fractioning and on which side you are more likely to have the splits between the movement. Know that they are contradicting each other between their speeches. The first speaker stated that race and gender form much deeper issues than economic class, right? Note this rebuts the second speaker because it proves that people splinter much more and faster when you group them in a class-based movement, right? White poor people reject black poor people because of their historical fractures are so deep. Know that they're contradicting each other when they are doing that analysis. Second, then, which narrative gets you more buy-in? Opening government thinks that people are much more likely to listen to you on the idea of economic poverty rather than identity issues. Note that the problem with class-based difference movements is that you have to have the extra burden of persuading people that they are in dynamics of oppression in the first place, right? Because you do have pro-capitalist education, you have pro-capitalist media, right? From the time that the individual was born and went through life, they were overwhelmingly taught narratives like the American dream, the fact that you can make it because you have control over your social mobility if you just work harder, right? Because you are very normalized in the dynamics of the economic system, for example, the employer-employee relation, or the fact that workplaces just don't tend to be democratic. Know that people don't question this. They are incredibly normalized to this. Know that this happens even if people, as they say, don't have food and they live in really bad conditions, because you still have it in your head that you maybe deserve this and maybe you just didn't work hard enough. You still perceive much more agency in that situation than you perceive when you are being discriminated because of your race or because of your gender, because you are aware that this is something that you never could have chosen. The implication of this are twofold. Number one, it's the people that you are trying to mobilize do not think they are oppressed on that basis in the first place. They believe they have agency. They in a way that they wouldn't believe it when it comes to race discrimination or gender-based, which is much more visceral. Right? You're much more likely to perceive things like catcalling, much more likely to perceive things like violence against Black people, because it's something that people are still not normalized to in the way that they are normalized to capitalist system. Know that social movement just can't change this normalization, given that they start reasonably fringe. They have to get that mobilization in the first place. Look at the fact that many poor people do support things like tax cuts for the rich, because they just think principally you should have libertarian paradise, even though they know it's against their interest and it's obviously oppressing them in many ways. I genuinely think that when OG says that you can plausibly deny racial issues, comparatively, obviously, it's much harder than denying issues of capitalism. Secondly, you do not perceive your identity as static, right? If I am poor now, I assume that I can become rich later. Given that, I have much more focus on escaping the condition of being poor. I don't care about the other poor people than trying to increase the welfare of poor people, because I believe that maybe in a year or two, I'm no longer going to be poor, given that I'm going to not waste my energy of trying to get more political capital for that group, given that I believe I'm not going to be part of it. Given that, on the comparative, opening government is not going to get their mobilization in the first place. Know that their impacts rely on the fact that they will have broader group when they are going to be able to lobby. But even if you for some reason buy that our movements are going to be of a similar size, we think that they are still less likely to be able to effectively engage with the state, for a couple of reasons. Number one, on how we are being perceived by the state. Know that politicians and state apparatus in general will perceive you as significantly more threatening if you are a class-based movement. The reason for this is because identity movements can often work outside of these state structures. If you are trying to, for example, change hearts and minds like LGBT movement, trying to make the identities normalized, know that you can't do this as a class-based movement, because you always need to engage with the state, because you, for example, need things like legislation, you need if you need minimum wage increase, you always have to interact interrogate the state. Know then that the state perceives you as incredibly threatening. The reason is because very often when you're trying to do things like redistribution, which is necessary to improve the conditions of the poor people, you need to do things like force corporations or force rich people to give up large parts of their privilege. The reason why this is perceived as incredibly threatening by the state is because governments often rely on, for example, big corporations for things like tax revenue, or they base their economic performance and legitimacy on good performance of big corporations. Because of that, states are always much more skewed towards the interests of big corporations, meaning that if you are a movement who's directly threatening their interests, you are likely to also be against that movement. This doesn't happen on their side, or on our side, insofar as you are much less likely to be directly threatening like the very foundations of what the state relies on. Secondly, know that political parties can all try to cater to you, right? Because if you are an identity-based movement, both Democrats and both Republicans, or any parties, whatever in the UK, whichever other example you can take, all of these parties can reasonably include this in their manifestos, right? All of these parties can technically try to pander to you as a movement, as a voting bloc. Note you can't do this on the state, on class-based movements, insofar as very often the divisions between political parties are in the first place based on one party likes redistribution and one party doesn't. Because of that, you will always have just the one party who's technically able to engage with you, but not the second one. Because of that, we think that you are less likely to be able to get things like political compromises for your side in a way that you would be probably able to do, for example, as a feminist movement, as a movement like LGBT movement, given that both parties have the incentive to try to get you as a voting bloc. The third thing Jacqueline tells you is in terms of rich people. Note that on their side, they have maybe they have movement full of people who do not have, as they themselves say, the political capital. They do not have the capacity to lobby. They're often seen as disposable, often seen as not being able to contribute much in terms of donations, etc. On our side, given that the rich Black person still faces the struggles of being Black, they are much more likely to fight for your movement in terms of lobbying or representing you in politics from the inside. Because of that, you are much more likely to get change from that side as well. For all these three mechanisms, you are much more likely to achieve your goals, and you have bigger movement on our side for all those reasons opening up.
Thank the speaker for those remarks. On all speakers on the top half of the debate. To begin the debate for the bottom houses, we welcome the member of government to extend on their side of the debate. Hear, hear.
Right, just a sec. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So we think OG did a very good job at giving a framework for this discussion, but then they were attacked effectively by OO that they just assume the mechanism they are, that the motion that they are offering will provide a mechanism for a class solidarity that will actually affect on the reality. So I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. A, to explain why it's very likely that you indeed will get some class solidarity. B, why we will be effective in helping the needy, and the bottom ladder of the social structure, and see why it actually will also create less friction between race and gender and things like that, and we actually get some of the things that Oak Bench wants to get on their side. Just one thing, we get the idea that you have indoctrination and the idea of social mobility at the point that most of the poor people probably are generations of poor, probably your father and your grandfather. Maybe, yes, maybe the TV tried to sell you indoctrination, but you probably don't buy it. At the moment that you see that all the people in your neighborhood are a couple of generations poor, you see that, yeah, theoretically, I might have the capitalist dream, but it's not likely because people know statistics, but more than that, they just see what's going on around them. So we don't think people really care about this indoctrination. And we think that actually being poor is not so distant from being for a certain gender or for a certain racial group in terms of what people think about themselves. So why we think, now the first point, why we think that class solidarity is very likely to be created. We think that on our side, what social movements try to say, they try to do some strikes, they try to do some demonstration for the raise of the minimum wage or sick days. We think that every movement needs to and they also try to create a villain. So while if you are a black people or female or women, you want to create like the black to the white man as your villain. On our side, the villain is the capitalist, is the tycoon, and is the lobbyist that serve them. So what we get from that? We think that this is a message that poor people, regardless of the race, can unite after. They all want a better wage. They all want to beat the villains, the tycoons that hire them and then fire them, or like the Jeff Bezos of the world that just like the working conditions are just unbearable. But beyond that, in order to actually succeed, for example, if you have a strike, if only the white people are striking and the black people don't strike, then the black people can just replace the white people and vice versa, right? So in order to have a successful strike and in order to get something that all the sides want, they need to cooperate. They need to communicate with one another to say, oh, we are the white, you are the black from the other neighborhood, but we need to strike together in order to get the things that we all want and we all wish. So we feel that at that point in time, we have cooperation. More than that, we feel that the people that are more engaged, the people that are more likely to be the social movement leaders, are probably have some kind of university education, are probably like they came from the neighborhood, like get some education and got back because they and like had something in life, because we think that those are the people that are most likely to have the time and efforts to put that. At the point that they are probably liberal because they have a bit more education and a bit more time to think about things, we think that they are very likely to actually encourage, as the leaders of the social movements, to encourage a cooperation between white and blacks, and to explain that to the community, to different communities, we need one another because alone we are weak and together we are strong. So what we get from that, we get like a social movement that are working together, black and white, men and women. So why it will be effective? Please note that in order to bring social change, we actually don't need a buy-in of the whole society, right? Because if you have a strike, maybe I'm the biggest capitalist in the world, but I do want the strike to be over. So at the point that we have better strike, we have more demonstration and things like that, just for the sake of like getting rid of the annoyance, some people will say, all right, raise the minimum wage and fix that. But beyond that, at the moment that you have more posts on Facebook, you have more relatives that are bringing these messages, you have more politicians that have like political initiative to talk about those issues, there are more chances that people that are not from the working class people will actually buy into our socialist change that we want to bring on. So we think that also, we get some talk to some about racial identity or gender identity. We think that most of the time you probably have like within the social movement. We probably have like black people for worker rights or women for worker rights. That's the moment that you have like black people that are not part of the working class still supporting this kind of department because they feel like they are like the 1% of the black people that actually made that, but they need to serve the other 99. So we actually get some degree of solidarity between people from the same race or from the same minority on our side as well. Before I move on, I would like to take a PY from opening.
Yeah, so your mechanism relies on everyone striking together. When you're a woman who has been catcalled and sexualized your entire life, why would you strike alongside the people who oppress you? Your opening gave the analysis as to why race and gender is historically more entrenched.
Thank you. Yes, maybe you were catcalled, but you want money to feed your children. So if somebody tell you, now we can work together, so you say, yeah, maybe those people were sexist, but I believe we have a common enemy that is is like stronger, which is the tycoons, the lobbyists. People tell you that yes, we can cooperate. Now things will be different. And see, like it's very unlikely that the specific guy that catcalled you on the street is also the guy that you'll see in the social movement. So we think that yes, maybe some men catcalled you, but it's not like you are now hating all the men in the world. We think that there are some kind of solidarity. But beyond that, why we think that it will decrease levels of tension between minorities and like the majority group? We think that discrimination is is the source of unbiased stereotypes, because people don't meet each other. Now that they have a reason to cooperate, to meet each other, then it's very likely that stereotypes will just collapse, and you feel better about those people that you before that you didn't really know, so you just thought what you heard in the news. B, we are specifically talking about white working class. Those are the people that are most likely to vote Trump and populists. Everyone that they know better. That's why we have in our society less power for populist politicians that actually ignite those populist ideas about racism and stuff. So I think that we are actually getting better. This is the things they want to get on our page, and that's the reason why I call you to propose.
Thank the speaker for those remarks. And to begin the extension for side opposition, we welcome the member of OP. Here. You're muted.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
I'll start in 10 seconds. First off, we acknowledge that yes, there are both class differences and identity-based differences in the society. People face repercussions, people face everyday problems because of these differences. But this debate is about when a greater part of the society is vouching to minimize or diminish one particular difference, which one they should, why they should, and why this is particularly important in current times in 2020. Which one is something that needs to be solved first, which one the people from the society needs to go in the streets and work around. All right, so let's first talk about the class differences. So understand, in a country where there are people from different has different types of monetary status or status levels, the poor people or general citizens, there's a government that needs to work in order to cater for all of them, right? So the government will have certain levels of facilities that will be catered towards all citizens. There will be public hospitals, there will be public schools, there will be government schools and stuff like that, which will be providing fundamental needs to each and everyone, to people to be the poor, be the rich. So these the practical barriers that a certain people of the society in a country faces. There will be things that facilitates them. These are very practical, different, materialistic that everyone knows and everyone acknowledges. So when it comes to movements, what's the ultimate point? We want to ensure that A, these differences are mitigated, and B, to ensure that the people get what they deserve, right? So when it comes to social movements, understand the fact that we need to clear out things that people have a different mindset about. We need to clear out the stereotypes. And the stereotypes are much more greater in a world where there are a huge level of identity difference. Why is that so? Understand that when we talk about rich or poor people, why is someone poor in the first place? Either it's because he was born poor, or if moving forward he did not get the opportunity to change his status. Everyone knows that that's a very practical thing too. But the stereotypes that exist within genders, within racial differences, within religion, the fact that people consider probably a woman to be does not have enough of physical strength, the fact that people consider that people from a certain religion might have extremist views or might do things against society whatsoever, or to break the peace or whatnot. These are the stereotypes that have been systematically brought up and systematically deep-rooted into the minds of the people in the society. And this is something that needs to be broken. And in order to break this, you cannot just simply say this is the fact that people understand that there are no differences. You just simply educate them. That does not happen. This is the issue where you actually need people to come down to the street, people to actually vouch for, and people to actually create a social movement in order to change and break these stereotypes. Versus when we talk about class differences, these are the things that we practically acknowledge and we practically know, and we know that there are things that have been undergoing in order to change the status. We doing social movements is ultimately not going to have a much tangible impact in changing the mindset of how people perceive these poor people or how people perceive these rich people. Yes, there will be, but the extent to which is much lower in comparison with identity differences. Furthermore, when we talk about the time, the contemporary movement, understand where we are not living in 100 years back when there were when the people used to buy black people as slaves and whatsoever. We in the current world where we're living in, the major problem that we are unable to solve in major portions of the world is identity difference. The fact that it took so many years. After so many years, there's only one black US president that ever existed. There's only just one female vice president that ever existed in US. There's only one superhero movie like Black Panther where there is a black superhero. Is the practical evidence that the fact that the representation of different gender and different race and different religion is still very, very minimal in the society, which is why this is the particular sector that we as individuals of the society need to work collectively in order to change this particular representation, in order to create a more equitable society. This is something that the contribution of we as parts of individuals of society ultimately ends up giving us a much greater impact compared to the class difference. So all of this gives me what? All of this tells me 4 things. First, the fact that ultimately the fact that working on identity difference is more important, because due to this there are much greater stereotypes that we break, which ultimately cause to reduce the hate crimes or hate speeches that have been going on for years and years now. Secondarily, we tell you that when we are working with identity difference, we are able to bring in a lot more people into the movement, because this resonates on a greater level because of the common ground that people have, because of the fact that will be people who will be born with a different racial structure, will be people who will be always born with different gender, which means you will always find someone to vouch for your gender movement or vouch for your racial movement. Versus even government, the OG speaks that there is majority, there is minority, there is a larger subset and a smaller subset. So in a world where there are 90 people who are just simply rich and 10 people who are poor, I don't think that those 90 people, those rich 10 people that their status will ever get changed. But in a world where we work for identity difference, it's more easier to bring people on a common ground. The moment we have a black person who is catering for not only the rich people from the black, but also from the poor people from the black. Similarly goes for gender and other things. So we believe that it will resonate on a greater level. And thirdly, the fact that there is a greater level of discrimination occurring based on identity difference, and the fact that these are completely deep-rooted in the minds of people, it's much more important in order to ensure that these forms of discrimination are reduced when we work for identity difference. And lastly, all of this leads to the success of social movement, which is the ultimate point, because if we just continue doing movements, ultimately we don't have any tangible or impactful change in the society. That does not matter. And the fact that you can actually change your status of position of power or your monetary status. If that was not the case, probably someone who used to sell teas in the street would not become the president of India. The fact that he did is because of the fact that you can change that particular class difference position. But the fact that identity difference is something that is a much more important and pressing issue in order to work in the current time. This ensures a greater dynamism in the populations and in the sets of people that we live in the society. It breaks greater myths and stereotypes. That is why all of these reasons it is more important, and this resonates on a much greater level. Very proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for those remarks, and I would like to welcome the whip speaker for side government to conclude for their side. Here.
Okay, am I audible? Okay, if there are any POIs, please write them in the chat, because if you just raise your hand, I probably won't see them. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we see two main clashes in this debate. The first clash is where we will get more effective structural change, and the second is where we get more effective social change. The difference between the two is that structural is more like about state discrimination, like discrimination laws, politics, worker rights, and all that. And social change is more about like day-to-day interactions, what people see around them when like go out, walk around, and interact with other people. Before I get to explaining why we win the debate through those two clashes, I have 3 points of rebuttal to the oppositions. First, to opening opposition. Opening opposition's main case rests upon that it feels much more inherent when I'm discriminated against based on my identity and not based on my class. They say that if I'm discriminated against because I'm Black, it's far more traumatic. Like, I feel I have no agency because I can't control that. We say that that's completely on the contrary, because you don't actually have any more agency when you're poor. If you work as hard as you can and you don't advance at all, even if you work like 10 hours a day, all day, and you just tend to get to advance, and it just doesn't happen, then you don't feel any agency at all in that way. On the contrary, there are far more examples of successful women or successful minorities than examples of poor people lifting themselves up by the bootstraps. If I'm discriminated in one workplace, then I can always go try to search for another workplace that has more liberal ideology that is more likely to accept me. But if I am poor and I have no money and no education, that is something that that is inherent. And it doesn't matter if I go to another workplace, because no workplace will accept me if I don't have the skills to advance from a class-based metric. So that's why class-based discrimination is far more inherent, because without outside support, that's far less likely to break. Also, second, most poor people aren't stupid. They know their problems stem from poverty. If I'm poor and I know that I have no money to get an education, and I have no money to fund my children's education, and I have no money to buy food, then I know my problem is because I don't have good enough working conditions and I don't have good enough wages. I don't need to go onto the internet and to face no discrimination from any other source to know that my problem stems from poverty. If I'm poor, I know my problem stems from poverty, and it's not unlikely for a social movement to cater to those problems of poverty. Like, it's possible to be Black and poor and still be disappointed that you're poor, even if all your other problems aren't erased. Now, to closing oppositions about stereotypes. Most social movements don't actually do much to negate stereotypes. The main thing that they do is work from the structural side. That means that they go to prevent state discrimination and prevent police brutality, for example, or promote equality laws and things like that. Like, for example, feminism doesn't really do much to negate stereotypes against women, other than, for example, integrating women into the workforce actively. We don't get much of the mechanisms of why these social movements, like how these social movements actively do to decrease stereotypes. And if they state that social movements do decrease stereotypes, that needs to be analyzed why. Because as of now, it's simply an assertion. So now to the clashes about, first of all, structural change. Where structural change is where we get more change, like from the state level, from the level of the laws. I'll explain to you why for the structural change, we need to get far, far more people, and also explain how we get more people and also more political parties to support our cause. And that's through the explanation of tribalism, because OG did explain why it's easier to get more people to support our movement if our movement also encompasses them. But Eyal gives you that additional link, which says that not only are people less likely to join our movement if it doesn't encompass them, for example, a social movement for minority if they aren't minorities, but it's more likely that our movement will generate active animosity from them. If there is, for example, Black Lives Matter, which focuses on the fact that there's police brutality against Black people, then white people will feel far more like they'll feel in danger, they'll feel under pressure that there is that movement, Black Lives Matter. So it's not that they won't join, they'll feel more likely to be active against it. And that means that from the politics side, it's far more likely that politicians will try to cater to that animosity in order to oppose these social movements, which means that a positive action that the social movement comes, there will be a negative reaction from the side of politics, because it doesn't matter how much they advance, because the more popularity they gain, the more animosity they gain. Eyal explains to you why it's far better for that animosity, because that animosity is inherent to any movement. You can't have a movement without animosity. It's far better that the animosity be towards the higher economical class, because a higher economical class, first, they are far, far fewer, therefore they have less political power, and it's far easier to get a party elected based on entirely social, workers' parties and all of that. It's far less difficult to get a party elected from an identity standpoint, just in order to get a majority from an identity standpoint. Therefore, on the clash of structural changes, we get far more better. So now to the second clash about social change. Well, for social change, we also get on the opposition side, we still get that animosity. That means that if there is, for example, Black Lives Matter and feminism, and for example, then feminism is a good ideology, and many people do support it, but many people also oppose it because many men feel threatened by feminism, which basically hurts the cause. But on our side, people can still support these social identity ideologies through the class-based ideology, because first they are united against that common enemy, against that oligarchy and whatever. And after they are united against it, after they have a common goal, it's far more easier to plant in these social ideologies in order to bring them forth. Yeah, before I continue, I'll take opening.
If you are being constantly told that you can't get the job or promotion if you are because you're mother or you are irrational, you will always perceive patriarchy as your enemy rather than capitalism, which are normalized to. Given that, we have more mobilization, and by entangling the harmful stereotypes, you remove the obstacles to economic prosperity as well.
The thing is, there are numerically more people that can't get a job because they are poor and don't have education than people who can't get a job because they are women. Like, we do have progression. Like, women can get jobs today. It's not as if a woman going to workplace after workplace and constantly being rejected because she is a woman. That's far more likely to happen from poverty. Therefore, we are far more likely to get people frustrated and feel that they have no out because of poverty. Now, back to social changes. So opening opposition's basically only case for social change is saying that it's far easier to get companies and parties to cater to you if you're a social cause, because that gets less animosity. But Yal does explain to you why catering to a social cause does get you animosity, so we don't even get that. And regarding to the case about stereotypes from CO, then we also get more effective combating of stereotypes when people do work together against a common cause, because I'll explain to you, when many people are united and working together, like Black people, women, and men, and all that, then we do get that combating of stereotypes, and we do get that positive perception of one another that we don't get when these movements are isolated. So because we get more positive structural change through numbers and more positive social change through day-to-day interaction, we are glad to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, speaker, for those remarks. And now we'd like to welcome the whip speaker for side opposition to conclude the debate. You're here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
All right, I'll just take 30 seconds. Setting my timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Honorable Speaker, I think the metric that this debate should be judged on is whether which side shows that that's higher likely for movements to succeed more, right, and ensures a higher likelihood of success. For that, I think social movements need as much support as possible from the maximum number of different people, as well as you need people for that support to happen. You need people to care about these issues, and you need people to and you need to address the most pressing issues that are happening in the world right now for the social movement to succeed, right? So we think that focusing on identity-based differences is a much better mechanism to achieve those goals of social movements, right? So I'll start with some rebuttals to both the opening and closing of government. They talk about how if we focus on identity-based differences, some groups of people will feel threatened, right? And that threat will cause the social movements to not succeed. But understand that the same threat exists on when you're focusing on class-based difference as well, because the same threat to reject and oppose change will also exist on their side as well. Because in order to ensure equal distribution and equal redistribution of wealth and economic equality, the mechanism through which that might happen will be higher taxes and they're basically taking more money from the rich and redistributing it to the poor, right? But we don't understand why that these rich people or people from the affluent social classes will be so accepting of this idea of redistributing wealth. They never really prove that to us. It means far more likely that more people will want to. It's far more likely that more people will oppose these movements, because these rich people often are in a capitalist society are the one who control the power structures. This means that these people will oppose the movement and make it very difficult for these movements to succeed. It means that it's much harder for these movements to negotiate and demand changes with the government, right? from the government that relies from the government that relies a lot on the support from these affluent classes of people, from these large corporations and these rich businessmen. We think that this similar threat also exists on their side of the house, right? And we think that these when opposing government talks about like how these poor people know that their problems stem from poverty, and that is why it's more important for them to solve it. Yes, that's true, but they also know that this is a very materialistic problem, right? And this poverty can be countered by working hard and making the most of their opportunities. That they have a way out of it. But what they don't have a way out of are these race-based problems, are these race-based differences that they really can't do much about, right? A Black woman faces a lot more problems because she is Black, and a Black poor woman faces a lot more problems because she's like poor and Black. And thus, like their problems are only exacerbated, and their problems are to integrate into society and to make the most of their opportunities and work hard. And even if they work hard, it's much more harder for them to integrate into society because they have these, they face like racial discrimination and systemic racism in the societies, right? So what do we tell you from our side of the house? And like, why do we bring this way? Because we tell you that these identity-based issues encompasses all the different kinds of problems that people faces, right? For example, African Americans in America right now who are fighting against systemic discrimination and racism is something that people of all social classes are facing, right? This is a shared experience that everyone in that race is facing. Thus, economically mobilizing these people based on classism and economic equality wouldn't solve the issues that that are more pressing to them, that are more that they face more prominently. This means that if these people from this means that even if the people from rich social classes support this movement, it's unlikely they will care. They will care about poor people outside of the race or gender or their identity group, right? Because but when it's based on identity that people from all social classes face these problems, it's much more likely that they will support these protests because they know what it feels like to be discriminated. They know what it feels like to be excluded from society based on their identity. But secondly, we talked about how the class-based differences or rich versus poor are very materialistic and practical. It also means that these people don't necessarily blame the rich people for the problems that they face, but rather they often know that that in a capitalist society, they still can overcome these differences and these barriers by working hard, and that is a very individualistic point of view to have, rather than individualistic problem to have, rather than like collective problem that social movements often target. However, identity-based differences are something that these people care about more, because firstly, these identities are something that you're born into and you can never change, right? As compared to like class-based differences, which you can overcome by working hard and making the most of your opportunities. But secondly, these identity-based differences is very visible in every aspect of your life and every interaction that you have, from your very birth to when you die, right? And so in some way, these are the issues that these people care. You usually care more about than poverty. This is because these people who are being oppressed and socially left out, they often bond on these based on these struggles and on these sufferings, regardless of whether that person is rich or poor. This means that if social movements focus on these issues and solve the more pressing issues which are these identity-based issues, then it's much more likely to gain more support and bring about social change. We also think that in the current world, people who are poor have more access to social movements and mobilizing social movements. How? Because they can support these movements through social media, right? They often have access to smartphones and the internet. They can mobilize and support people on the ground level. And most of the problems that they face as people from the lower social class, these problems are often exaggerated and exacerbated by these by the race that they belong to. This means that it's more important for them to address those issues, because if those issues are solved, they can now better integrate in society by making the most of the opportunities that they cannot do right now. But we also think that the identity-based differences are more pressing issues because the problems that they're causing are much more prominent, right? And much more much more difficult to solve, right? Because these result into extremism, it results in hate crimes, it results in systemic racism that excludes people, regardless of whether they're rich or poor, from integrating society. But it's far more important that these poor people can integrate society better by overcoming these identity-based differences. These are the things that they care more about, which is why we think that our social movement should focus on identity-based differences rather than class-based differences. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for those remarks, and thank you everyone. So it's just me, so I guess you don't actually have to leave the room. You can just stay here and I will return eventually, because one of the panelists' internet regrettably dropped out. So it's just me. But yeah, I'll see you in like 15 minutes, but more like 10 maybe.